Hey everybody, Mr. Maupin here with another APUSH video focusing in on topic 7.4, the progressives. Now, previously we talked about the impact of Theodore Roosevelt as our first progressive president and having a tremendous impact on the economy in terms of, negotiating contracts between labor and management, the production of consumer goods, regulating the railroads, trying to take steps to preserve the environment, and in many respects, just overall revolutionizing in many respects the presidency in terms of using that power in a way that we hadn't seen before domestically, but certainly will be a template for future presidents. Now, note, because of the very, very popular domestic progressive policies by the square deal that Roosevelt's going to be enacting, plus success globally with numerous, imperialistic policies, Roosevelt is going to become an extremely, if not wildly popular president. And he was a very young president. Remember, he's the youngest president in American history. He came to office following the assassination of his predecessor, William McKinley, at age just 42. So by the time we get to 1908, Roosevelt's still in his 40s. And he loved being president. He had almost limitless energy in the job. There may not have been a person that had more of a emotional quality to love the job, maybe more than Theodore Roosevelt. And so in many respects, he would be a totally fit candidate to run again. Except in 1908, if he runs again, it would be his third term as president. Now, note, there's no law or constitutional amendment against running for a third term at this point in time, but there was a very noticeable two-term tradition that dated all the way back to Washington and was, modeled by Jefferson and Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Grant, Grover Cleveland, and Roosevelt didn't want to be seen as the person, even though he loved the job. And he almost certainly would have easily won again. He didn't want to be that person that came off looking like a would-be autocrat. And so, he will make the decision, though tough for him, to step away and continue that two-term tradition. Now, that being said, just because Roosevelt is going to step away and not run for a third term, that doesn't mean that he's just going to be sitting on the sidelines and let the results of the 1908 election just kind of, go their own way. Far from it. Roosevelt is going to be very active in trying to promote who he thinks would be his best successor. And for him, it was pretty easy. It was his, very good friend, not just politically, but personally, Cincinnati's own William Howard Taft, as you can see pictured here. Now, Taft had served in a number of different roles, particularly in terms of foreign policy. And most importantly, Roosevelt trusted Taft as someone that shared the same values as him as a Republican progressive. So Roosevelt is going to give his full-throated support for William Howard Taft in the 1908 election, and that was as good as gold. That pretty much was all you needed to win. The Democrats are going to put up William Jennings Bryan for a third time, but just like the two previous times, Bryan's going to come up short. And so Teddy Roosevelt is going to be playing a critical role in getting Cincinnati's William Howard Taft elected to the presidency. Now note, one of the things you got to keep in mind with good old Taft is that Taft is going to have a very different personality and energy level for the job. Roosevelt, as I mentioned a moment ago, loved being president. He had limitless energy. Remember, this was a guy that could get up, eat, 6 eggs, wash it down with a pot of coffee, go out and, chop trees for exercise, come back, read 300 pages in a book that day, meet with a dozen different political leaders, go out and play 5 sets of tennis, and get up and do it again the whole next day. He loved it. He loved the politics. He had the energy for it. He had, all of that. Taft, totally different. Taft was not a gregarious, back-slapping extrovert like Roosevelt. Taft was a quiet, reserved person. He was not very energetic, not at all. and he just didn't seem to have that same joie de vivre in terms of being the chief executive. In many respects, historians have shown that Taft maybe didn't even really want the job that much. We know that his wife Nellie certainly pushed him to go and take this job, and he kind of begrudgingly, out of a sense of duty to Roosevelt and to make his wife happy, he ends up, running and winning. But what's ironic is that, his wife Nellie, that really wanted that job, she actually passes away before she actually moves in as the first lady. So you've got this guy Taft that kind of half-heartedly wants to become president, and now he's in the White House. And what's going to be important to note is that Taft is not going to be a puppet of Theodore Roosevelt. He's just not. Taft is going to be his own man, and that's going to, be positive in some respects, but it's also going to create a number of consequences. So let's get into the Taft presidency on a domestic level. Remember, Taft, in terms of foreign policy, he's the guy behind dollar diplomacy. But here, at least at home, when we talk about Taft, he certainly is going to get the reputation for being the most aggressive trust buster of any of the presidents of this era. We know that Roosevelt certainly was the first person to be trying to take down trusts, but remember, Roosevelt didn't necessarily believe that trusts were inherently bad, but he was a believer in regulating trusts. Taft was much more of the mindset that trusts, monopolies are inherently problematic, and he took a much more aggressive stance at chopping them up. For example, probably the biggest scalp that he's going to get in terms of breaking up monopolies will be none other than John Rockefeller's Standard Oil. That will be broken up during his time in office. And that's going to, win over some progressives, but also rankle some other Republicans. Something else that's going to be taking place during the Taft administration, this time towards the end of his term in office, will be the creation of the federal income tax. We saw an attempt at the federal income tax during the Civil War for a couple of years. That was temporary. We saw an attempt at a permanent one in the 1890s, but then the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. So what do you do when you have a law that's unconstitutional? Well, you go back and amend the Constitution. Therefore, you can't find it unconstitutional. Now, note this is going to have a dramatic change on how the federal government raises revenue. Instead of focusing in on tariffs, almost overnight, those debates go away. And now the federal income tax is by far the largest source of revenue. And what used to be debates on tariff policy has now become debates on income tax policy, as it still exists today. Now, as Taft is continuing his time in office, as I mentioned, Taft is going to be proving that he's going to be his own man. He's not going to just be TR's puppet. Now, note, it's not like TR was living in D.C. still and just kind of, looking over Taft's shoulder all the time. TR was busy traveling. He was going on safari in Africa, and, he was, really, really active. But when word does kind of get to him slowly that, Taft is starting to do some things that he doesn't like, that's going to start to create a rift between these two longtime friends and political allies. So what is this, rift going to be based on? Well, it's going to be based on two things. One is the passage of the Payne-Aldrich Act, which is going to be raising tariffs. This was something that Roosevelt was adamantly opposed to. He did not feel the need for this raise in tariffs. He thought it was unprogressive. But Taft signs it into law. And progressives are going to feel like, hey, is Taft in the pocket of some aspects of the business community? Yeah, he's the trust buster. But if you're raising tariffs, you're clearly making it, tougher for consumers. But the thing that really kind of is the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back is what's going to be the Ballinger Pinchot Affair. And it's going to be centered in on this guy right here, a guy named Gifford Pinchot, who was the U.S. Forest Director at the time. Now, you got to remember, he was somebody that was first put into office by Taft's predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt. And we've mentioned before how Roosevelt was a very, very, adamant environmentalist. And Pinchot shared Roosevelt's beliefs. However, Pinchot's boss, Mr. Ballinger, who ran the Interior Department, was not quite of the same mindset and was starting to show a willingness to sell off federal lands to private businesses. And this was seen as an affront to what Pinchot believed was the true progressive aims environmentally of the federal government. Now, Pinchot is going to, air his grievances with his boss in the newspapers, with the idea of, hey, this is going to get Roosevelt's attention. Roosevelt's going to kind of come in and put pressure on Taft to, change these policies, do a better job, a more progressive job of protecting the environment, yada, yada, yada. And yeah, Roosevelt does, kind of swoop in, but it doesn't change what Taft supports. Taft supports his Interior Secretary. And bottom line, if you are found criticizing your boss in the media like Pinchot was doing, you're going to get yourself fired. And that's what happens to Pinchot. And for Roosevelt, that's really his last straw in terms of tolerating a clear difference in philosophy between himself and now what was once his protege, William Howard Taft. So this is going to lead to a major both professional and personal rupture between these two guys. And this is happening at the same time as well as you are seeing the rise in what is going to be socialism in America. When you look at the progressive era, it's not just a time of reform, it's not just a time of more federal government intervention, but it's also a time where you are seeing perhaps our most leftist radical sentiment percolating in America. You got to understand that, the effects of capitalism, generations of laissez-faire capitalism, are going to lead to some problems. We talked about this: unsafe working conditions, inadequate pay and benefits for employees, dangerous consumer products, major gaps between the rich and the poor. And for many folks, they looked at these as being inherent consequences of capitalism. And instead of trying to reform capitalism, there were some that were saying you can't fix something that's inherently broken. You have to do away with it and bring in something different. And that's where socialism is going to come in. Now, what is socialism? Socialism is the idea that you need to have government ownership over major industries. Industries such as the oil industry, steel, cattle, railroads, telephone lines, things like that. Things that are vital to the success of a nation, but have been used as a way to exploit the working class to enrich a very, very, very small percentage of the U.S. population. And so the idea being is that these very important industries should not be based on personal profit, but rather for the benefit of the nation. And the man that's going to be embodying these values is going to be a very interesting character by the name of Eugene V Devs. Now, Devs, you may have heard of him before as the union leader that's going to organize the Pullman strike almost 20 years earlier. So obviously Devs has a long track record of voicing the concerns of the working labor union class. And he will be the poster child for what he is trying to create as a socialist revolution. Now, I don't mean a violent socialist revolution, but the idea of, winning people over in the polls to elect a truly leftist socialist president with the goal of truly radically transforming the American economic system. So, we saw populism in the 1890s as, pretty, radical for the time. Well, now we're even going beyond that. So Devs is not going to really represent most Americans, not even close, actually. But he is going to be serving as an outlet for a number of folks that did share those sentiments at the time, and perhaps it was the most popular time for that in our nation's history. Now, where are we going with this? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are setting the stage for what is going to be one of the wildest elections in all of American presidential history, the election of 1912. That will feature not only Eugene Debs here as the socialist candidate, but three other men, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, that will all be at one point or another presidents of the United States. It's going to be a wild one. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.